Hello everyone, it's Wednesday evening. I'm James Harding. I'm the editor and co-founder of Tortoise. And if you remember, you'll know well that Wednesday is our open news meeting. We're open to really any thoughts, any stories, any angles that you think we are not covering but should be, or are covering but not even that well. And so all thoughts gratefully received. But we're trying, as we witness what's happening and try to understand what's happening in the invasion of Ukraine, use this time to go a little further, a little deeper on some of the big issues that we see. And we were going to kick off tonight by trying to assess the implications of the, if you like, corporate exodus from Russia. I'll be honest with you, I think that we're seeing a level and quality of reporting that is incredibly impressive across the news. A lot of it, though, is overwhelming, and some of it is quite hard to understand. And I would say that I'm personally finding the question of what companies are choosing to do, which ones are really doing it, and what the long-term significance of all of this is, very hard to read. And at root, I don't know whether or not what I'm seeing is a group of big companies with obvious reputations and as a result, more visible responsibilities, taking acts of, if you like, solidarity and symbolism that by their nature are short term, or whether or not a chapter of globalization that began in 1990 with the movement of Western capitalism across the globe has ended in 2022 because international companies, either by the force of sanctions or by the expectations of the market and the public, have realized they can't operate in the marketplaces of aggressive nations and countries that don't operate to the rule of law. And if it's the former, this is a blip. And if it's the latter, then a generation's idea of globalization is coming to a close. And so rather than just bounce that idea around, which I hope we will do between everyone who's joined us from the Tortoise team and members, we've also asked a few people to come and help kind of read into specific issues here. Ian Peters thinks for a living about business ethics. Jason Nisse and I basically started out as reporters, but Jason now thinks about how do you advise big companies making these fundamental reputational decisions. And Alistair Carmichael sits in the middle of all of this, trying to figure out how the intersections of politics and business and, frankly, society, your constituents, meet. And Alistair, I wonder whether we could just start with you, because we often think of these issues as being decided, if you like, in kind of the corridors of the Treasury or in, the, CEOs, plush offices. But actually in your constituency, they're being decided on the docks. Actually, people are deciding what does and doesn't come off the tankers. And just, can you explain to us a little bit about what's happened and then what you think it means?
Okay, I mean, first of all, I think you've absolutely contextualized the discussion beautifully there, because one of the things I think that politics has struggled to come to terms with in recent years is the way that globalization has affected politics and continues to affect politics, because you have seen this shift away from government and politics on the one hand towards corporate interests on the other. And the great paradox is that the political response to that challenge, which to my mind requires countries either bilaterally or multilaterally to work together, actually has produced a political zeitgeist, which is essentially the opposite. It's a nationalist one. But the truth of the matter is that, and I think this is, I don't think it's a change in how globalization works. I think it's just a different aspect of globalization coming to the fore. And it is that the consumer power, which is what the corporates ultimately rely on, has found an issue around which it can coalesce and about which it cares enough to influence corporate behavior in that way. And whether it's a short-term or a long-term thing, remains to be seen.
And can I just ask you,
Yeah.
can I just specifically, by the way, I'm so conditioned by Zoom now that if you're watching this, you can see that Alistair Carmichael is a Lib Dem MP from Scotland, Orkney and Shetland. But if you're listening, of course, you've no idea that's the case. So I should have just introduced Alistair. But can I ask you? Can I ask you the case around workers intervening is different from reputation management, and it does suggest to me that there are two elements to this. One is, how do labor as in people who work, step in and get themselves engaged? And the second question it raises is, if you choose not to unload containers from Russia, which other containers from which other countries or which other polluting companies do you choose not to unload to?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, the situation that we had in Orkney was we had a tanker coming in from Softcom Flot, which is a company wholly owned by Putin appointees. So the money that it makes for the business for transporting oil around the world was going to go back to the Kremlin, and then would fund Putin's war effort in Ukraine. So it was a fairly simple, straightforward challenge. One of the aspects was that the workers in the oil terminal said, no, we're not going to touch this, and their union said that they would support them in that. But there were other aspects at play as well. There was a big community effort, and from the comms point of view, an island community at the north of Scotland of 22,000 people raised against the might of the Russian Federation it's the working definition of David and Goliath. But it was the effort of the community as well as the workers that brought it to the position where it was the #3 news story on the BBC website on Sunday into Monday, which was then what started the reputational concerns coming from some of the corporates, and ultimately Total, who owned the oil that was going to be transported, felt that they didn't want to be exposed to the reputational risk. They withdrew, and government at the same time stepped forward, and Grant Shapps wrote to all the ports in the United Kingdom asking them not to deal with Russia in this case. And in some ways, that's the easy stuff. You're right, James, in that if you accept that as a principle, as being something that's right and proper to happen, then once you start extrapolating that principle across a globalized economy, then you do come up to some really hard cases. And it's easy when it's Russia and the Ukraine, because there's such a wide consensus, and there's so much public attention, such strength of public feeling, not just in our country, but right across the world. So I don't know where this all goes in the future. I just know that there was an imperative when we were faced with that situation as a community that we acted, and we achieved more actually than I thought that we were ever going to achieve. And once we are past this moment, we learn the lessons of it, and it may be that there are more opportunities in the future. But this wouldn't happen without the strength of consumer feeling, community feeling, and the trade unions were part of that, but they were not the whole story.
Alistair, will you stick with us if you can for a bit? Because I want to pick. I'm going to come in a moment to I think one of the kind of central questions that Charlotte has put here, which is, is what you see from whether it's a McDonald's or a Coca-Cola or an Accenture or a McKinsey, is that politics and not necessarily substantial in terms of business, or is something really, really significant changing underneath? I just want to hear from Jason and Ian first for a moment. Jason, what's your read on this? I mean, I imagine you're getting quite a few people who are actually asking your advice, and are you saying to them, close, halt for a moment, keep your head down and hope it goes away? What's the best advice to businesses?
So I think you've got to realize that we're in a different scenario than we've been in almost any other situation in living memory, because we're actually in a war, and the West is waging economic war against Russia because it doesn't want to wage an actual war against Russia. So it doesn't want to send in NATO troops. It doesn't want to send in NATO aircraft. It doesn't even want to allow Ukraine to use Polish MiGs that are available. So they're waging economic war. So when you're waging economic war, there is no middle ground. You're either for it or against it. If you don't support it, you're essentially seen as supporting Putin. And that is the scenario that we're in. And therefore, responsible companies, large corporates who operate substantially in the West have no choice but to boycott Russia. They have to pull out. Now, you get a few on the margins, and I was just going to read you an interesting statement from Danone. So Danone, as you may well know, are the big French yogurt makers. We all have their yogurts in our fridges. And they said that they're going to stay in Russia because we have, and I quote their chief executive, responsibility to the people we feed, the farmers who provide us with milk, and the tens of thousands of people who depend upon us. Now, whether you can defend that or not, it is a point of view. It's not about responsibility. Heineken has pulled out, stopped sending beer to Russia. It didn't stop brewing beer in Rwanda during the genocide. So it's not a case of large companies will act responsibly because it's a bad situation. They're not. They have to take this position because they have no choice. And if anybody who I've advised, I've said, you have no choice. A friend of mine asked me for advice about whether he was to stay on the board of a UK listed company controlled by Russians. I said, you had to resign. He's resigned. People have said to me, can we continue doing business with Russians? I said, no, you can't, because we're in the middle of this war.
And can I ask you a question, Jason? Can I just ask
Sorry,
you a question?
can I just make one last
sure.
point here, which is, the other thing is that most companies should realize that once you pulled out of Russia, you can't go back in until Putin's gone. Simple as that. He will remember. He will punish you for as long as he's in power. So you're out until he's gone. So they are betting that this will blow back in his face and he'll have to scarper and go and join his girlfriend and kids in Switzerland.
So, by the way, this may be one of those moments where we're going to continue with the line of questioning and miss the story. Do we know his girlfriend and kids are in Switzerland?
It's been reported. That's what's been reported.
Okay, well, we'll try and find the girlfriend and kids in Switzerland. Let's. But in other news, Jason, is it? So you've actually just answered one half of my "is it real" questions, i.e., if you pull out, are you essentially kind of pulling out? If you're McKinsey or if you're Accenture, are you pulling out and thinking we'll be back in 6 weeks, assuming that you think that those companies have no realistic prospect of running a viable business until Putin is out of office?
Entirely.
And then can I ask a different question?
Putin's not a rational man. He's not somebody that you can actually sort of negotiate with.
So, and then my second question is there a kind of world that we see, big names, big brands who make announcements, but behind them, there's a world of private capital or privately run businesses, many of which may be offshore, that might actually not just be continuing to do business in Russia, but exploiting the opportunities that come from a cheaper ruble, etc. Is there a two-tier response to Russia, one that is big business and in the public eye versus private capital and out of it?
Well, you've already seen that. There's a fund manager called H2O Management, which is, I think it's a German-run Liechtenstein fund who's taken a big bet on the ruble. So they've bought loads and loads of rubles because they think that this will blow over in a short term. There are people who will take that risk, and there always has been. That's why, I've forgotten the name of the chap, the Israeli businessman who's now being up on all sorts of different charges, was buying up mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo during the Civil War, and made a lot of money out of it.
Jason, I'm going to come back in a second to you. Can I just ask you one thing? Is there any way, though, that if we wanted to, we could track private, non-listed investments in Russian assets, Russian currency? How do you find out what they're doing versus what public listed companies are doing?
Unless there is public record. I mean, they can set up shell companies in Jersey and the British Virgin Islands or whatever, and then go or in Cyprus. Cyprus is a great typical route. Malta. They can go through those companies. You would never know that they'd invested, or vice versa. So the only way, so just practically speaking, the only way that we pursue this, because I think you're right about H2O, but I'm absolutely convinced there are UK-based investors who are making a market judgment, not as you put it, a kind of right and wrong judgment on this. The only way that you figure out where the money's going is presumably then through the Bank of England or a relevant regulator. You identify, you say the Bank of England has got to ask all of these investors to track where their money is going and whether or not it's touching Russian assets. Is that right? Is that the only way you get there? I don't even think the Bank of England could find that out. I mean, if you've got the money already offshore, you just move it offshore, you move it around in different places. I mean, the Bank of England can track flows of UK currency abroad, but it wouldn't be able to track that. It wouldn't. The money's already placed elsewhere. You and I have money in pension funds which are in pots in offshore locations. Simple as that. We probably don't know about it. We probably.
Jason, thank you. I'm going to come in a moment to my colleague Patricia Clark, who's been trying to look into performance of financial services and professional services companies. I saw Zoe Blakemore had a point about that too. And I want to bring in my colleague Luke Bedimer in a second about what we do on the R100 and all this. But Ian Peters, I imagine it is a busy time in the business of business ethics. Do you take a similar view to Jason, which is it's not just an ethical one, it's a practical one. The West has made a choice, you have to fall in line.
I mean, these things are never black and white, are they? And actually, that's the nature of ethics. It's not black and white. It's shades of grey. And I think, there are different motivations depending on the organisation. So, companies are not responding in a particular way for all the same reasons. Certainly, some of the ones that moved most quickly, I think one might assume, and probably shouldn't assume anything, but perhaps it's more likely that they did it out of principle because this was out of line with their values. They considered it carefully and thought, what, we've got to take a stand. But of course, those values are not set in isolation and they change over time. So that they will be reflecting on the view of society, which in our case and their case is the view of Western society. And it's clear that Western society is saying this is unacceptable. So if you're a company and you don't fall in line with that, then arguably your values are out of line with the values of society and of your stakeholders, shareholders, pension funds, investors, employees, customers, and so on. So you're taking a big risk. So you can't really divorce the values issue, if you like, the point of principle, the ethical behavior, from the effect on your reputation and the fact that you could do untold damage. The two are inextricably linked. And I defy anybody to completely separate them and say, oh, this is all on the basis of principle. I mean, it'd be great to think it was, but in practice, everything comes into play.
So Ian, can we just for a moment pretend that everyone else isn't here, and let's take a not entirely academic question, right? Which is, how do you make judgments on the people that you work with, right? So what I mean by that is, I think if you listen to or read the reporting we've done, it's pretty clear that we as a group of journalists at Tortoise think that this is an act of unwarranted, unprovoked aggression against a democratic and sovereign country, and wrong as an example of Europe's worst history revisiting itself. Right? The position is really clear. Then there are companies that you work with, some of whom will have a position where they say similar things, but still operate in Russia or with Russian clients. Some say similar things, but pull out of those operations in Russia. Some decline to say anything at all because they don't want to, they want to sort of keep their head down. How much do you think businesses should be judged by the businesses they associate with? How much would you, as a sort of ethical advisor, where would you draw the line on that?
Well, probably I imagine Jason would give similar advice that, this is about integrity. And if you say one thing and do another, if you put out a great press release, say, oh, we're withdrawing, and then you continue to work in Russia, you continue to associate with companies in Russia, and in other words, you don't do what you've said you're doing, or you imply that you're doing something and then you don't do it, then clearly that's not acting with integrity. And probably, the one common value that most organizations claim to have is that they act with integrity. And it's pretty transparent if you don't. And your investors, your employees, your customers, your trading partners, your suppliers, etc., will see that. They'll call it out. They will recognize it. So you're taking a big risk if you decide that you're going to say one thing and do another. And of course, we would advise, no way should you do that. You absolutely have to stick by your principles. Otherwise, what's the point? What's the point of having them in the first place? And I've just been working with a company today, and has a set of values, and at the heart is integrity. That's usually the critical value. But we're all going to have to form a judgment, and it's interesting the pace at which some companies have moved, because clearly some have waited and waited and waited until the pressure has grown and grown, and in the end we're going to pull out. Was that on the basis of principle, or was that because that it's just getting too hot in the kitchen?
Yeah, it's interesting, by the way. And as you're talking, I'm just looking at some of these points in the chat, which is underline exactly what you're saying. Picks up on Jason's point about Danone, Unilever saying something similar, Uniqlo trying to figure out a way through. So as you say, it's not black and white. I'd like to just pick up on the sort of, I'm sure there's a kind of clever way of saying this, but the hypocrisy point, right? Patricia, the question that we've had is, are companies saying one thing and doing another? And particularly given, I think, the focus we've had in the reporting on Evgeny Lebedev, on Russian money previously, on enablers, professional services, financial services, I think you've done a ring around, a right around to find out where the big law firms are. So what have you found so far?
So I've looked into the big law firms and the big consultancies. Both kind of need to be looked at separately, but I'll start with the law firms. So contacted them to figure out whether they're still operating their offices in Moscow, whether they are still working with Russian clients, be that individuals or companies, whether they will be taking on new contracts, and whether they what's the phrasing? Basically, they see this as a war, and whether they agree that with the IPCC statement that these are war crimes that are going on in Ukraine. With law firms, the response has been particularly interesting because not all of them have responded, but those that have put out public statements have said that they are keeping their businesses running in Moscow. That's Clifford Chance and Novery. I thought it was interesting.
Clifford Chance and ANO, sorry, Patricia, just a bit slowly.
Yeah.
Clifford Chance and ANO are saying they're going to continue operating in Russia.
They're continuing to operate in Russia. Freshfields has pulled out completely. And most interestingly for me is the fact that they haven't used the word war. Now, they've called it an invasion, they've called it military aggression. There's a non-cynical way of looking at it, which is that there's new laws in place in Russia that can put people in jail for 15 years, specifically journalists, for calling this a war. So they might have the interests of their staff in mind when they're putting out a statement like that doesn't mean to call it a war. There's a few sort of cynical ways of looking at it, which is that they're sort of trying to protect their financial interests. And also, when it comes to contracts specifically, what I've heard from lawyers is that the use of the word war can mean that there is a get out clause for certain contracts. So it could mean that they lose a lot of money. So that's the very cynical way of looking at it.
And Patricia, just forgive me, just so I got it right. So Clifford Chance and ANO continue to operate in Russia. Freshfields has pulled out but doesn't use the word war. Is that your point? Or none of them have used the word war? I'm
not sure about Freshfields on the word war. I'm talking about the ones that are keeping their offices open. Freshfields, I'll double check for you. So that's where we are at with them. I'm trying to figure out, because none of this information is public, how the money flows. My understanding from speaking to people who were at the company is that most of the contracts that they have in the Russian offices are Russian contracts. A lot of them are on the sanctions list, and also contracts in China. And so, is it basically set up? Because the other thing that I've heard is that since 2014, they've been trying to get around the much smaller sanctions that were in place at the time. The contracts have become increasingly sort of local in the Moscow office, and there's the sense that perhaps this was something that was going to happen. So I think they are prepared for the eventuality that they may have to sort of become an independent thing. So I wouldn't be surprised if that happens in the next couple of weeks. I think that's and then companies. I don't know what the moral. I'd be interested to hear from the experts what their moral obligation is, basically, because I think they can then have a separate entity that doesn't sort of feed them, that is no longer connected, but the contracts keep going, and then when the war's over, they can sort of buy out the company again. Is one possible outcome. I'll stop there, but we've also looked at consultancies which have something different going on.
No, well, hold on, don't stop there, because it's all quite good. The consultancies. So, by the way, Jason just put in the chat, what about Linklaters? Says it's pulled out, but still advises Evraz. So there's some that are staying here but working to Russian clients. Yes,
that is another point that's really interesting. That a lot of them have pulled out haven't been clear on whether they will still be taking Russian contracts internationally. So and now I'm jumping from law firms to consultancies, but Kpmg and Pwc have both said we're pulling out of Russia completely. They put out quite strong statements. I think I'm not sure about the wording actually, but they were like, we're pulling out completely, but actually they haven't committed to ending overseas audit work for Russian state entities, whereas Ernst & Young, for example, have. So it's so murky, it's so dependent on the industry, it's so dependent on the company itself. You have to sort of dig into the wording. But yeah, it's really interesting.
Okay, by the way, as if Lindsay Evans, Lucy Huberman and I had actually rehearsed this, I'm going to now go to Luke Bedimer, because Lindsay and Lucy, the reality is at the meeting we had this morning, actually when Luke and Alexei wrote the Tech State Sense Maker, if anyone read it today, they'll have noticed that actually the behavior of the different big tech companies is really striking. And it prompted Katie, in fact, my co-founder, to say, hey, why don't we look at this through the prism of the Responsibility 100 and see whether or not if you followed each of the 100 companies in the FTSE, you could map the walk and the talk. And as you'd expect of someone who loves a good idea but it doesn't do the work, I then said, good, let's get Luke to do it. So Luke, where have we got to on trying to do this, and how difficult is it to do in practice?
Well, sort of as a direct follow on from what Patricia was just saying, it is murky, and the details of it will certainly vary by sector and by company and by relationship. But to sort of cut to the chase, we need to ask the companies first of all, and so that's what we're going to do over the next day or so, and hope to hear back from them for the end of the week. What we're asking them is a bit dependent on whether they have a subsidiary in Russia or not. But essentially, we're asking everything from, have you closed your offices? Have you ceased operations? Have you stopped accepting new contracts and other projects with Russian clients? And to the handful of Russian companies that are in the FTSE, or in the pair of Russian companies that are in the FTSE themselves, we're asking how the sanctions have affected them, as well as some other questions. I think also, just from the research that we've been doing today, and I should say it was not just me, but Alex and the rest of the team, we're hopeful that we might be able to learn some stuff from disclosures of payments to government, which all companies in the FTSE 100 have to make. And it's a document that's normally sort of squirreled away in their investor information rather than in their main annual report or sustainability report that says, this is how much we've paid to these governments all around the world as a group.
Paid, Luke, sorry, forgive me. Is that paid as in taxes?
In taxes, but also other payments might be made in violations and fines owed to a particular government, or fees for the use of land. So there are a few different payments that go into that disclosure, but the bulk, I think, is tax. So what that would tell us, if we look at each of those 100 disclosures for every company over the last year, is how, I mean, a crude way of put it is like, how deep are you in the Russian kind of space? Because that the amount of tax that you owe them will be a good proxy for that. But just going full circle to Patricia's point about it being a bit murky and complex, we'd also need to look at the scale of the business to understand whether actually they're heavily involved with Russia and therefore paying high taxes, etc., and fees because they're a big company or because they're heavily involved. So that's where we're at with it. And I think just very quickly on the framing of the Responsibility 100 and doing a tracker, we were talking this morning about how a company's stance on this, particularly if you're in the FTSE 100, the 100 biggest listed companies in the UK, this is a real test of that characteristic of responsibility, how you've approached what's happened in the last few weeks, and the stance that you're taking to the point you made at the top, James, about solidarity and symbolism and a short-term approach rather than something that's lasting and meaningful and will at least wiggle your bottom line. So yeah, it'd be interesting to hear what Ian and Jason make of that.
Luke, can I just one thing, just practically speaking, so if you put out, what do? We email the companies in the next 24 hours.
Yeah.
What do we do? Follow up with the call. What's a reasonable expectation of the timeline of getting this kind of information? Because I see Lucy's point, which is, actually getting the information might be quite hard. And what happens if we get the response from 30 to 40 companies and it ends up feeling very patchy?
Yeah, well, I mean, I imagine the ones that will be quickest and get back to us most readily will be the ones who have nothing to say on the matter. And we'll have to look. And I was reminded of a bit of research I did earlier, late last year, into OnlyFans, asking the sort of biggest banks in the world, what were they doing about financing people who were creating pornographic content or other types of content on those platforms. And most of the response I got was, we have no comment to share on this matter. So that's where the disclosures are quite interesting, because that's a way that we might be able to start to assess this without necessarily having to be offered it on a plate by the companies themselves.
Luke, thank you. I'm going to, there are a fair few points I want to pick up in the chat, but I just want to come back to Alistair Carmichael for a second, if I might, because sort of halfway through this conversation, and a lot of these issues end up at some level or other requiring lawmakers to help either with transparency and disclosure or setting the rules. And I don't know, forgive me, Alistair, are you in Westminster or are you in Scotland?
No, I'm in Westminster at the moment. Yeah.
So what, of course you must be off yesterday. So what's the conversation around Westminster, not I mean on party lines, but amongst MPs, of the hierarchy of things that need to be done around companies in terms of guidance, requirements, disclosures?
Yeah, well, you saw a flavour of that at the beginning of the week with the bill that we put through in all stages in the one day. That's the economic crime bill is one that we've been waiting for years. And it's always been on the too difficult list. So we haven't done it. And then suddenly, because there is an imperative, we've been able to act. And even for those areas of contention that remained, essentially the signals that were coming from the government side of things was, well, yeah, actually, you know what, we're probably going to find a way of doing this, just not tonight. And you know, that sort of that agenda is very much one which has caught fire now. And government has to be seen to be at least keeping up, if not being ahead of public opinion in this. And I guess this is where the politics of it comes in. The Conservatives are acutely aware that they are very exposed in relation to some of what they have done. You mentioned Lebedev, but also the influence of Russian money coming into the Conservative Party, and they know that they are politically exposed. So, I mean, listening to the talk about the way that the corporates have responded, and going back to my initial point about globalization having taken the shift of power and influence from government to corporate interests, I think some of what you're seeing here is corporates now beginning to behave in the way that governments used to, and responding to the stimulus that they were getting from their consumers. The question will be ultimately, when this is all played out, how much of that toothpaste will they be able to put back in the tube? Or will it be that, having got a taste of what consumers can actually do, they're going to want to do more of it? The Clifford Chance thing is absolutely fascinating because they are one step removed. So, McDonald's have to rely on however many million people buying their burgers or their chicken McNuggets or whatever it's going to be. Clifford Chance are probably relying on a few hundred, maybe a few thousand big corporate clients. Now, if this continues to develop in the way it has done, if you see the ripples going out, and if people are saying, well, it's not enough for, and I don't know who Coca-Cola's lawyers are, but say for argument they are Clifford Chance, it's not enough for Coca-Cola to come out. If you're still working with Clifford Chance, we want Clifford Chance to be sacked by Coca-Cola, then that's where it could really get interesting.
I agree. And I guess the real question, one of the things is trying to work out, Alistair, how you find the leverage through Parliament to identify those relationships. Because weirdly, the pandemic did the same thing, is we have an interest now in supply chains. I mean, none of us never talked about supply chains. Now we all are interested in those relationships, right?
And look, things that we have spoken about for decades, like, CSR policies and the rest of it, which have been in so many instances a sort of ethics wash, if there is such a thing, are now going to have to get real. So that might actually be, this might be a moment where that imbalance between corporate and government and regulatory forces can be pulled back a bit. And that's where we could ultimately see a bit more of a longer lasting effect of all this.
Alistair, thank you. I'm going to come to my colleague Tess Murray in a second, and Zoe Blakemore, she's still there. But Jason, I saw you had your hand up and you wanted to come back, did you, on something that Alistair was saying?
Yeah, I think Alice is right about the consumer point of consumer pressure. Although consumer pressure is not always very even and it doesn't always work. I don't think anybody is boycotting Holland and Barrett mainly because they don't know that they're owned by the Russians. what happens actually is what the companies are concerned about are two things very much at the moment. The first one is very public, which is the investors and the ESG, environmental, social and governance agenda, and investors saying they will disinvest if companies are not doing the right things in certain areas. Now, obviously, this doesn't apply to law firms because very few of them are public, but it applies to companies, banks, and investors are looking very closely at how the companies behave. But the things that a lot of companies say to me is what really worries them is that the people coming into the workforce, the graduates, the young people are so much more clued up than they were 10, 15 years ago, and they are making their choices on who they're going to go and work for by how those companies behave. And actually, that is actually what's changing a lot of attitudes in companies, which is the young workforce are voting with their feet and going to work for organizations that have these ethical things. And I think Unilever, which was seen for ages as being really good guys, their behavior in continuing to supply a lot of goods into Russia may well come back and bite them very, very hard.
But Jason, can I ask you one thing though? Because I asked Patricia this, I don't know, Patricia, whether you got anywhere, is if anyone has come across it, because I know that's true in theory, and I know the labour market is very tight, i.e., people have choices in the way they didn't do. But I'd be really interested to know, you take your two law firms, Patricia, Clifford Chance and Allen Overy, that are staying in Russia, whether or not they've had any people in their law firm resign and say, I'm not prepared to work. Have you heard, Patricia, have you heard anything of that kind, like WhatsApp groups, We're Cross, representations to the senior partner?
I haven't heard anything. I will, yeah. It's nobody wants to talk, but I will keep going because I'm sure someone will very soon.
Okay, well, we'll look at that. Ian, I'm going to come to you in a second, but I just want to ask Tess. Where is Tess? Is she there? Yeah. Tess, will you get out the sort of tortoise bullshitometer on this, which is how much do you think we are getting some companies, either for genuine reasons or otherwise just signalling, other companies in the same sector not, some businesses that are publicly owned being more out there, private businesses not, and businesses trying to have it both ways, i.e. reputational management, but keep the business?
Oh, well, thanks for the four-parter question, James.
There you go.
Yeah.
Three-part, we've got a couple of follow-ups.
Oh, God. I have two thoughts on this. One, I do agree that I think we might be seeing the most collective sort of employee activism thing we've seen to date, which is really interesting. I'm a horrible cynic. Obviously I've been in the city on both sides of the fence, asset management and investment banking. This money will wash around the world, and it always will. And we have so much in place in theory to stop it in terms of regulatory environments, business crime legislation. There's absolutely no bloody appetite to enforce it in reality, structurally. So I'm not quite sure what the question was, but I think there's a combination of genuine outrage, combination of performative business behavior. But at the end of the day, I don't think really companies know what they're getting into. What are they getting into? Are they getting into an apartheid situation where the only way they can possibly come back is when there's been a dismantling of the system? To Jason's point, you pull out, you can't go back until the system you're protesting against has been dismantled. So that means Putin goes, withdraws from Ukraine. What are the kind of, where do the hurdles get lowered to go back into Russia? What's that look like? Because we pulled out, well, when do you get back in? But the reality is, you and I's horrible, cynical, been around the block a few times grown-ups, know that private capital is still washing around. Benny and the boys from South Africa are still getting their hands on mining rights left, right, and centre. It's kind of performative.
And very uneven. Ian was going to make a point. I'm going to bring I think I'm going to see Matt Dancona somewhere, because I want to try and game out a little bit of what the domestic politics of this is going to be like if it adds to inflation and slows growth and makes Rishi Sunak's life even more complicated. So I'm going to come to Matt in a moment on that. But Ian, you had your hand up. Well, sorry, Ian, you muted yourself. So I think we were unmuting you and you unmuted. So
too many people doing too much unmuting. I very much agreed with Jason's point about, you know, the younger people in the workforce now are much more choosy, and there's a lot of information about that. There's a lot of surveys been done, and it's reflected in that sort of evidence that, you know. So you asked the question, James, you know, well, are people, you know who's resigned? Well, that's not quite the way it works, is it? People don't resign immediately, and especially, you know, in the present time, you know, they wait and see what happens. I mean, we're only, what are we? I've lost track now. Is it a week and a half into this war? 2 weeks? So, you know, over time, people will form a view and form a judgment. Young people certainly will say, I'm not carrying on working for this organisation. I'm going to look for something else. But they're not going to resign because they've got rent to pay. Probably can't afford a mortgage, but they've got rent to pay. They've got other things. So, you know, none of us. It's nice to have principles and it's nice to act on them. But in practice, of course, we've all got other things to take into account. I think the role of the investors is absolutely critical too. And Jason mentioned ESG. And, you know, okay, we can be very cynical about all of that, and I'm probably just as cynical as anybody else. But the fact is, you know, it's a massive subject of debate. It's not going away. And we've only just got past the COP in Glasgow, where how many organised corporates came out and are committing to their programs for the transitional arrangements around climate change. Now, again, we can all be very cynical, but the fact is that when public opinion starts to bite, organisations respond. And that's, if you like, my cynicism that, well, actually, why are they waiting for public opinion? They should be doing this anyway, and that's where the ethics come in. But, you know, I think, you know, as public opinion bites, then, you know, corporates have no choice but to respond to that sort of thing, because they don't get the investment, they don't get the employees that they need, they're in a competitive marketplace for the best skills. They can't get those best skills because people say, I'm not working for you, I'm going to work somewhere else that shares my values.
Well, Ian, thank you for that. I wonder whether or not, very early on, Zoe Blakemore made a comment about sort of the law firms. So I don't know whether you were there and you were able to sort of colour that in, because I think that is one of the things we're going to keep coming back to, is this question of different behaviour of the enablers. There you are, Zoe. Yeah, far away.
Yeah, I'm a corporate lawyer. I'm a Magic Circle, ex-Magic Circle lawyer, and it's a complex situation, because if you say to them, have you exited Russia? I'm sure they have, and I'm not surprised that the firm I used to work for has, because that's something that they would want to do. But they have very flexible structures, and they're going to have lots of clients that are not Russian who have Russian legal needs. So there's going to be all sorts of nuance in the way that they respond to your questions, in the way that they have to deal with the various responsibilities they have to clients. But it also means that because of the way that they're structured and they're so flexible, they can completely exit. But I assume that their partners in Moscow, who they will all know personally and care about, will remain an independent firm, which will be a connection back into the industry for them in future when things change. So I think that's...
So there's no clean, I mean, there is, I appreciate the world's complicated. There's no clean exit, if you like. I guess the difficulty here, Zoe, is for people who are, you know, as Tess says, going to be skeptical about this. There's no, how do you know whether or not it is performative or substantial?
It's very difficult. So they can decide not to deal with state actors. It can be very clear whether or not they have clients who are involved in the regime. And then I'm sure that they are walking away from private Russian clients at the moment because all of their other clients will have an expectation, a number of their other clients will have an expectation that they do, and they will all be speaking to their key relationships. The partners will be speaking to their key relationships and asking what they want to do and what the expectation is of them. Mm-hmm. So it's a much more personal and relationship-based organisation than a general corporate would be. The accounting firms are a little different again because they're networks, so it's slightly different again. And that understanding those different structures will help you get into what they are and aren't doing, I think. But they will have it's a good time to be a Russian qualified lawyer who isn't based in Russia, because there would be massive demand for Russian.
Yeah, that's right. You're not getting put out of work. I get that, Zoe. Thank you. Listen, I want to take a moment to stand shoulder to shoulder with my colleague, Matt D'Ancona, who wrote a piece at the start of the week, which raged against the, easy enthusiasm we have for saying we're going to stand shoulder to shoulder with the people of Ukraine and then not do anything to back it up. Matt, I think, people who read that piece, I think will really have struck a chord, because there is something infuriating about a kind of force of rhetoric that's not backed up by a force of action. But I just wondered on this subject, which is, if you like, the different end of it, if there are really significant consequences to this economic warfare, and I think we were talking this morning about oil prices rising, the potential of inflation going up to 8%, the possibility of another price cap rise in October, all of the hits on business and growth and consumer spending, Rishi Sunak's problems just got a whole load more complicated and expensive. And I wonder what happens, do you think, to politics as a result of this? Not the Britain and its place in the world, but actually Britain's domestic politics, given what happens to the economy.
It's amazing, isn't it? Because if you think about before the war, we were all talking about Boris Johnson's potential reasonably rapid exit, whether or not Rishi Sunak or Liz Truss would be his successor, and how different things look now. Rishi Sunak is perhaps the cabinet member with other than the Prime Minister, the biggest, and arguably including the Prime Minister, the biggest practical problems. 2 weeks today, or when it's the 23rd, isn't it? Whenever that is. So not 2 weeks today. He's got to stand up and make the spring statement in which he continues his promises to spend a lot of money post-COVID on levelling up and on the NHS backlog and other categories, that net zero remains central to the government's objectives, investment in infrastructure remains central to the government's objectives, but he will struggle if he doesn't do something, at least on an interim basis, to reflect the suddenly transformed attitude to defense spending throughout the Western world. So that's one immediate kind of problem. Another is simply, as you said, James, that obviously this is going to compound all sorts of problems that were already facing the government with regard to cost of living, inflation, energy policy. There's a massive tension within government at the moment between those who think essentially go hell for leather on fracking, drill baby drill, and those who say no, this is the incentive we've all been waiting for to really get pushed behind renewables. So there's that piece. The other is simply that what you're seeing here is what Priti Patel and her circle call the Merkel phenomenon, which is a reference to the huge enthusiasm there was in Germany around allowing a considerable influx of Syrian refugees in 2015, which then faded and became a massive political problem for Merkel. And there's a sense among a lot of senior Tories that at the moment the public is foursquare behind sanctions, behind opening the doors to refugees, behind measures which are helpful to the Ukrainians, and we in the newsroom probably on the whole support, and in many cases very strongly, but that a year from now, 2 years from now, that enthusiasm will have faded, and whoever is in government, assuming it's still the Conservatives, will be left with a very big check to pay politically and financially. So I think
Matt, can I just ask you one question, Matt, just to link the two things? Are we missing something here? It just goes back to Jason's point right at the beginning, which is this is an economic war because the government doesn't want to fight a kinetic war.
Yeah.
Is there going to be a moment that someone stands up and says, the price that is being paid for the lack of military intervention, for the lack of that no-fly zone, is being paid by the people of Kiev and Mariupol and the refugees, but is also going to be paid by British citizens because we haven't fully priced in how much this is going to cost us, how many businesses close down, that there's a price to come, and economic warfare is not invisible.
I agree with everything you just said. I mean, I think that underlying everything, there is an actual decision that has been taken, which is the West is going to squeeze Putin until regime change happens. But that could take years.
Yeah.
What it is not willing to countenance yet is the military action that might accelerate that very dramatically. And understandably, because we know that the escalation that would be involved in such action could involve nuclear weaponry and other non-conventional weapons. So it's not a totally ridiculous calculation, but it is a calculation. And you're right. The implications are not just ones of conscience; they're ones of practical day-to-day existence in this country and the standard of living.
Matt, thank you. I'm going to give, now that we've sort of dissected the world of politics this way and that, actually, why don't we turn to someone who is actually in the world of politics? Alistair, I'm going to give you the last word. And I know you had your hand up, so I imagine there was something particular you wanted to do. But I just want to know, as an acting politician, what do you wake up tomorrow and do about all of this?
Goodness, you're asking me to predict what I'm going to be doing tomorrow. That's great. Look, I think the heart of this is something that Tessa said, and somebody else as well. And they said, that you can't go back to doing business while Putin is there. And the significance of that is to be found in the way that business does business with government, because traditionally, conventionally, you would expect the big corporate interests to be counselling government to soft pedal on sanctions. It's too difficult. We've got big assets. I'm pretty sure that one of the reasons that we were a bit slow off the mark with sanctions is that people like BP and others would have been saying to government, look, we've got significant assets invested in Russia at the moment, and Putin will nationalize them if you go too far. Now, business wants to get back into Russia. I'm pretty sure about that. So their representations to government in this country will all be about getting rid of Putin and going harder and faster and piling on the pressure to bring the earliest possible ending of that. So that's where I think you will see the change in here. That's what I think will actually effect change in a way that you wouldn't have normally seen hitherto. And what am I going to get up and do tomorrow? Maybe not universally popular, but actually I think for the political class at the moment, we've got a bit of catching up to do with the corporates, and the attention I'll be spending on will be to do with the refugee offer, because that's where the government's still got a lot of catching up to do.
Certainly has, Alistair. Thank you very much indeed. Listen, thank you everyone for joining us. I'll just tell you what's on our to-do list as a result of this conversation and the inputs we've had and the discussion on this, because I do think this is one of those places where if you're a slow newsroom, you can actually try and follow some of the developments. So as Luke said, he and Alex Inch and the team are looking at the Responsibility 100 Index and doing a carve out on behavior and actions on Russia. I think, Patricia, there are a couple of things specifically on there. You picked up on the point from Jason around Evraz, and there are a couple of those companies. I mean, Evraz itself actually is a kind of listings question, but I think it'd be useful if we got all the data together of actually just publishing something that says, you know, possibly even the sense maker, this is what these law firms are doing, these are what those law firms are doing, this is what these consultancies, just spelling it out would be a very useful thing. I didn't get to Natro, I'm afraid, but the H2O point and the French investment bank, I tried to look into it. I don't know it, but I think that is worth looking at. I think we should really keep an ear out for this reporting of young people, you know, voting with their feet. I appreciate Ian's point that these things don't happen immediately, but where you did see it, or you did see the kind of behavior by workers that Alistair's seen as his constituency on the docks in a law firm or a financial services firm, would be a really significant moment. You know, I think Tess is right about that, about kind of employee-led capitalism is a really interesting thing. I know I'm obsessed by Rishi Sunak's choices and the fact that sooner or later he's going to have to front up and realize that he's got a choice and it's not going to be the one that he likes, it's going to be debt. I think trying to get into some of those conversations in boardrooms, because I think, Jason, the point you made, which I hadn't really appreciated, was these companies that are pulling out now have worked out that they're pulling out possibly for years, if not, you know, longer, means that the discussions around the board table have been much more contested than you might have thought. And so I think there's some storytelling to do there. I'm sure I've missed a few things, but that'll certainly keep us busy. Thank you very much, everyone, for making the time. A particular thank you to Jason, to Alistair and Ian, but thanks to everyone, and have a good evening.